what's going on, friends and family? My name is Skylent, and over the years, I've played all these different MMOs, and all the gameplay you're going to see in this video is all my own gameplay that I captured while doing reviews or covering the titles as they're releasing, all my excitement, all my hype, and yet, even though that these are some of the most popular MMOs, or at least one time, or the most interesting, the most exciting, no, I'm going to use them as examples. So just keep in mind, like, I don't think that these are wholly bad MMO, but they do have parts of them that I think are the perfect examples that you guys can relate to of what I think makes a bad MMO. These are my top 5 reasons why I order or reorganize list videos in certain ways and drop games down. Or maybe I'll just, like, you know, begin a rant video and be like, this game sucks. Well, these are why. These are why. So that's pretty much it. A little bit, you know, behind the scenes into the criteria of an MMO critic. This is my opinion, though. I would love to know yours in the comments below, but here's my top 5 reasons of what makes an MMO bad. Let's keep the hype alive. So the first one is a pretty obvious one for overwhelmingly most people. The example being Black Desert Online, a game that I actually champion, and I do often actually do sponsored videos for them, but I always cover it from a unique perspective. So pay to win sucks, and when I cover this game, I do not participate at all in really, I guess you could say, the base game. So the grind and the PvP aspects, even to the point of like the cosmetic stuff, like building your house and things, that's even competitive. You could maybe even debate that the character customization is actually pay to win. But basically, there's a lot of really shitty monetization in Black Desert Online. So yeah, shitty monetization, you can kind of wrap that up here, but no, the pay to win, even if it's debatably or in a gray area of pay to win, no, it completely perverts the actual core gameplay. And so when I cover it, no, I don't. I talk about it as if it's a machinima machine, a game that I can use for just its character creator, a game that I can play just to take screenshots in, or just to play as like a role play sort of experience. But the actual, you know, fighting and PvP and stuff like that, and trying to climb leaderboards and be the top, you know, percent player, which I normally try to do in all the games that I ever play, because I game games, I don't just play games or let them play me. No, it really ruins it for me, and I think a lot of other people. Even if it doesn't ruin it for you, I think we can all agree it's pretty distasteful. Pay to win makes an MMO bad because it affects, you know, it is an MMO. It affects a massive number of players. It can't actually have a ripple effect with the entire economy, with the way the entire game is actually played. Next up, the example is Guild Wars 2, my favorite MMO, actually, and that's going to be if meaningful updates come too slowly. And I think that just punched a lot of you guys in the gut there. So Guild Wars 2, yeah, I love it. And their expansions have been pretty revolutionary. You know, they've had some really cool stuff going on. And the first year of Guild Wars 2 was very experimental, incredibly innovative, and you guys will never have anything like that ever again, probably. Like, it was super awesome. But after that, it's like, man, the updates really crawled to us slow. We haven't had like any new, we have had no new weapons. The classes have been pretty, you know, awesome with the expansions, but those expansions comes years and years apart, and we still don't quite have the content drip, you know, like the end game content drip that we have in games like World of Warcraft or Final Fantasy XIV. So Guild Wars 2 just updates really, really slow, and a lot of other MMOs do. And if you don't have consistent, I would say, service updates to your games as a service, then people do get bored. But as a one and done kind of game, Guild Wars 2 is actually really fun. Just run through the dungeons, you know, do the seasonal events once a year when they come around. And yeah, you know, buy the expansions whenever you're ready. Play at your own pace. In fact, I've bought in both expansions and I've barely played them at all. I'm still, you know, I just, at my own pace, play the base game. That's fine. That's okay. But an MMO is a living, breathing world. And if you're not adding in new breath regularly enough, people do drop off, people do not care, and it's really hard to maintain a guild like that in the end. So I think Guild Wars 2 is a great example of a game that at one point had tremendous amounts of updates, but then really fell behind, and now has a totally different kind of update scheme that a lot of people feel really weird with, that totally separates the player base. Halfway on the list, this is going to be something that I think a lot of you guys with popular MMOs really feel, and I'm going to use the example of Final Fantasy XIV. But this is basically any kind of like end game focused game, not even MMOs. It could be MMO lights. Yeah, there's a few titles I can definitely think of, but this is going to be, if most of the time you're just kind of sitting in town, which town focused gameplay is actually really cool. There was even some emergent gameplay from a few MMOs where it was basically totally focused of just sitting in town and talking and chatting and dancing or playing musical instruments. That's fine. You know, sitting in town can be fun, but when most of the time of your MMO is not exploring the MMO portion of the game, but you're just sitting in town and just queuing, you know, you're just queuing for dungeons, or you're just running through instanced gameplay. You're just playing like the, you know, 5-player or what have you, you know, small little party style content. You're not really doing like, you know, the faction versus faction, or, you know, these giant open world boss fights, or, you know, there's a lot of cool stuff you can do in MMOs. And when an MMO maybe has some MMO content, so it's like it's technically an MMO, but really when it comes down to it, but you know, Final Fantasy XIV and World of Warcraft, very guilty of this, where you're kind of doing dungeons. The dungeons are kind of like the big, fat, thick, really like the reason why a lot of people play. It doesn't make them bad games. And in fact, that's how I guess Final Fantasy XIV delivers its story. World of Warcraft is even competitive with its dungeons. I get it. It's not bad games, but to me, it would, you know, knock it down a point for being a bad MMO. In fact, if you are part of the sandbox MMO community, you know how controversial it was when Albion Online actually started putting in instances and ways that players could funnel through the game without being a part of the open world PvP content, because you need players to actually cycle through and rinse through all the different content so you actually interact with everyone. So if you can have people all in their little pocket dimensions not interacting with the massive community, it makes it a worse MMO. And I think most people who play MMOs hardcore, yeah, in our opinion. But I do want to say I am definitely a champion for options, and I think what Albion Online actually did with its optional instances was fantastic. There definitely has to be a balance, but when overwhelmingly most people spend overwhelmingly most amount of their time just sitting around doing essentially nothing but queuing for the content, which is not MMO content, I think that's distasteful. Number 2, this one's a big fat one for me, and I really want to stress this one, okay? So the example is World of Warcraft, because it is kind of an older game, and I think it's a lot easier to find footage of this very clearly with this game, because it is the World of Warcraft. Open world PvP does happen. There are big old raids and things like that. So my complaint of what makes a bad MMO is going to be performance related, and I really think games need to, you got to do better. If you're making an MMO, really, most of the time it seems that the games are just trying to have bullet points on the back of their box. They're trying to just sell themselves off of features, whether they actually kind of do the feature all the way through, or even if it even runs, you know? So you can say, oh, we have thousands of players on a server, but if 1,000 players are all together, that shit just crashes. No, that's, you know what I'm saying? That's not the same. So basically, I'm gonna actually say some hardcore numbers here. I'm actually being kind of like easy with this, with my personal bias, but I think this is realistic in my opinion. If a game drops below 60 FPS, I'm saying with like a, you know, an average, I guess, enthusiast machine, like if you have a gaming PC, right? You know, you got a thick boy. 60 FPS, if it drops below 60 FPS with 40 players in a zone, you know, playing together, fighting together, that's maybe some battlegrounds. You know, that's 40 players is not even like a Battlefield level, you know what I'm saying? Like Battlefield 64 players, right? So I really want to be more hardcore with this. Like, no, dude, it should be 120 FPS with 64 players. But it is an MMO, so there is potential here and there for, you know, more players, less players. There's also Pve elements generally. So this is also including like, okay, it's PvEVP. But if it's 60 FPS with 40 players and it drops below 59 FPS, I don't care. If it drops below 60 FPS with just 40 players, which some people would consider the absolute minimum for a game to be considered an MMO, then, frankly, it's a bad MMO. If it cannot run at a playable, gameable frame rate with 40 players, which is the minimum number of players for most people to be considered an MMO, objectively, that makes it bad. But now, going a little bit deeper, so sometimes it can be performant and stuff like that. Also, if a game drops below 30 FPS with 80 players, now I'm adding that extra little bit on because a lot of MMOs do design MMO content, like open world bosses, things like that, like Guild Wars 2. And so you will often encounter these things. And, you know, if you have like raids in World of Warcraft and stuff like that, and there are some rare mobs and some people would like, you know, jump on it as a guild or whatever, maybe. I have actually never seen anybody fight a world boss in World of Warcraft. But regardless, sometimes you do see large numbers of players around the world, And if 80 players get together and it drops below 30 FPS, then it's garbage in my opinion. So PlanetSide 2 does a pretty good job. I think Guild Wars 2 does a pretty good job. Maybe even Elder Scrolls Online to an extent. But World of Warcraft does not do a good job. It is pretty dated. World of Warcraft really excels in skirmishes. Open world, I think PvP is pretty fun. Yeah, dungeon content is really great. Arena, sure. But the actual World of Warcraft portion, it just has not aged well enough. It did fine enough back in the day, but the performance factor has not really kept up in my opinion, at least to the extent that I am hardcore about it. And a lot of MMOs are like this too. They don't even, 20 players get on the screen and sometimes it just does not even work out. Yeah, let me ask you, if it's lagging and the frame rate is garbage at like 20 players, does that really feel like an MMO? Does that really feel good? Can you really say that's a good MMO at that point? And finally, and most tragically, the number one reason for me, what makes a bad MMO, and you guys can hate on me for all you like, okay? But frankly, I'm right. Example is going to be Last Oasis, which I'm actually the moderator for the subreddit. I even applied to be a community manager. I was very excited about this game. In fact, a lot of people jumped on this game. If I'm not mistaken, it had like 37,000 players at one time. A lot of streamers jumped on it. My video was one of the most fun videos I ever did for first impressions on Last Oasis. I appreciate Last Oasis for what it is. I showed every other MMO content creator what this game was about in real time, in real life. When I was in California hanging out with them, I was like, oh my God, this MMO has freaking walking bases. I was genuinely enthusiastic about Last Oasis. However, the reason why I'm gonna have to say it is a bad MMO, or the biggest reason why you might call it a bad MMO, is that no one plays it, or it lost a lot of its player base. So this is just the example. The example is at the beginning, tons of clans were in the game. PvP was rich, it was ridiculous, tons of videos were coming out, a lot of people were having fun with the game, and then, problems arose, and updates weren't as quick, and there was a lack of content, and people dropped. So you could say all those are, reasons that it wasn't that great of a game, but what really makes it a bad game now versus then, even though technically it's got more updates, it's actually a worse game now because there's less players. By far. Almost no one plays it by comparison. There's a ton of MMOs where there's not a big enough player base to actually fill the content, to fill the time, and actually make it an MMO. For example, like with the numbers and everything, 40 players. If in Last Oasis, before, you could have clans fighting clans, you might have a third party come in, ridiculous stuff like that. But now, it would be pretty rare. You're just probably gonna get swarmed by 5 people, 5 versus 1, something like that. Maybe you might get a 5v5, but are you getting up to 40 players? Are you getting up to 80 players? In a lot of the games that you play, are you actually feeling any sort of massivity? And even if you don't, I actually think it's okay if you don't in a lot of games. They're designed to be isolating. Albeit Online actually has many instances where you're going to be alone for maybe even hours, and that's okay. However, if there is no potential for truly massive gameplay or zerging or what have you, or, open world boss fights, there's really no potential for that ever. And also, if the game was originally designed to be filled with players and then isn't anymore, and it doesn't have the PvE, or it doesn't, it wasn't designed to be played as a solo game, or potentially solo, or with little players, you're gonna feel it, and it's gonna suck, and it feels bad, and that's what makes it a bad game and a bad MMO. And a lot of people, you want to disregard that because you played it in the past, or it's, it was your favorite game, or you're playing it now and you're like, oh, I'm having fun. But in the end, objectively, you have to look at it. What makes an MMO an MMO? Frankly, it's the player count. It's literally in the genre distinction and definition. And if you can't even reach a massive population, which minimum 40 players in a setting, in one go, in one zone or whatever, if you can't reach that on a regular basis, which is just 40 players, then you're not as good of an MMO as other games. I know that's kind of being harsh, but frankly, MMOs are the genre that its player base, you really feel it the most. Secondly, you have like esport titles, MOBAs, arena shooters, competitive games. If there is no audience to watch the games, and if there is nobody competing, then it's not competitive. So if there is not a massive player base with an MMO, you really feel it. It's not as good as it could have been or could be potentially, and I think that's just a little sad. So, I do have to knock off points, lower it on the list videos and absolutely mention it, or talk about, people ask, well, why aren't you talking about this game? And I have to say, well, nobody plays it, so it's kind of not an MMO. But anyways, guys, those are my 5 reasons of what makes a bad MMO, or what makes an MMO bad, really. Like, I'm not saying that these games are bad. In fact, I chose these games because I like them. They were popular. They have generally positive reviews. It's just these portions, I think are very relevant. I think you guys can mostly agree with me or understand where I'm coming from. You've played these games, you know what I'm saying. And then you can now extrapolate that to games that I normally don't put on list videos, or I just shit on and rag on. Yeah, these games are filled with basically combinations of these or all these at the same time, and maybe a little bit more. Things that you would generally consider like, bad UI design or bad writing, things that just make a bad game. But these are things that specifically make a bad MMO or an MMO worse. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. What are the worst MMOs? Throw it down in the comments below. Like, what are the ones to totally stay away from? And if you do want to shout out a game that you've been having fun with, absolutely, always appreciate that as well. That's it, guys. All I can ask is, well, also by looking, at the Patreon, donations, like, subscribe, YouTube stuff, but all I can ask is you keep the hype alive. My name's Skylent, and I'll see you again next time.